What if Adam wasn't the first, and the Garden of Eden was not the beginning, but the aftermath of something catastrophic that Scripture never explains directly? Genesis opens by declaring, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." Yet the very next verse reveals a world already broken, without form and void, with darkness over the face of the deep. Language consistently used for judgment, not creation. So the real question is not how God began, but what was judged before Adam was ever formed, and who was already there when the foundations of the earth were laid. Stay with me. Like, comment, and subscribe, because once you see this, you will never read Genesis the same way again. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The sentence is clean, decisive, and complete, sounding like an origin with nothing missing. But the next line shatters the rhythm entirely, revealing that the earth was without form and void, as though something has already gone terribly wrong. The flow is broken, the tone darkens, and the question forces itself forward. What happened between verse 1 and verse 2? In the original Hebrew, Genesis 1:2 does not describe a gentle beginning, but a transition. Reading vehatohu, meaning the earth became formless and void. This is not the language of raw potential or a creative blank slate waiting to be shaped. The phrase tohu vabohu appears only a handful of times in all of Scripture, and every single occurrence is tied to judgment. Isaiah 34 uses it to describe a land laid waste by divine wrath. Jeremiah 4 uses it for a city reduced to ashes after devastation. Tohu vabohu never describes creation in progress. It describes what remains after desolation, which reframes the question entirely. Because the real mystery is no longer what God created in Genesis 1:1, but what happened that left the earth in ruins by Genesis 1:2. This is where what has come to be known as the gap theory emerges, not as speculation, but as an attempt to take the text seriously. A growing number of biblical scholars, ranging from early church fathers to Jewish mystics and modern theologians, have suggested that between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 exists a gap, not merely in grammar, but in cosmic history. A period before Adam, when a world existed and was judged. Scripture consistently affirms that God does not create chaos, but judges into it, declaring plainly that God is not the author of confusion. 1 Corinthians 14:33. Yet in verse 2, confusion dominates the scene. Darkness, disorder, and void. This contradiction raises an uncomfortable possibility, that Genesis does not begin with creation at all, but with divine aftermath, the residue of a buried rebellion, the silence after a lost war. Ancient Jewish tradition preserved in early Midrashic texts takes this possibility even further, claiming that God created multiple worlds before this one and destroyed them because they became corrupted and inhabited by rebellious spiritual beings. According to Bereshit Rabbah 3:7, God formed worlds and judged them until he created this one and finally declared it good. If that tradition carries even a fragment of truth, then the chaos of Genesis 1:2 may not be a blank canvas, but the ruins of a previous creation. And if so, what caused such destruction? Some early church fathers, including Origen and Augustine, speculated that it may have been the fall of Lucifer itself, the original rebellion in heaven, a cosmic war that spilled into the visible world and left the earth darkened and devastated. Ezekiel speaks of a glorious being, saying, "You were in Eden, the garden of God, blameless until wickedness was found in you." Ezekiel 28:13-15. But how could this be if Adam had not yet been created? the pieces do not fit. Unless Eden itself existed before Adam, unless the fall of that angelic prince predates the fall of man. If the true origin of Earth's chaos was not a natural catastrophe, but a supernatural judgment, then Adam was not the beginning. He was the restart. He was not placed into an empty world, but planted in the ashes of one. And with that realization, the entire narrative shifts, as Genesis becomes not merely a story of beginnings, but a redemption account unfolding from its very first breath. But this raises a new question that cannot be ignored. Who were the beings that existed before Adam, and what role did they play in Earth's forgotten past? Because in the next chapter, Scripture introduces figures who were already present when creation unfolded, those it calls the sons of God, who were there before the foundations of the world were laid. Job 38:7 states that when the foundations of the earth were laid, the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. A declaration that immediately unsettles the familiar timeline. If Adam was truly the first man, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who were these beings already present, already aware, already celebrating creation as it unfolded? This verse, often overlooked, opens a fault line in the narrative, revealing that before Eden was planted and before dust was shaped into flesh, others already existed, watching the work of God and rejoicing in it. These sons of God, known in Hebrew as B'nai Ha-Elohim, appear consistently throughout Scripture, surfacing not only in the book of Job, but also in Genesis 6, the Psalms, and the book of Daniel. They are never described as symbols, metaphors, or poetic devices, but are presented as real heavenly beings, ancient, radiant, and powerful. Yet Scripture also makes clear that not all of them remained faithful to the role they were given. The ancient Book of Enoch, a text held in high regard by early Jewish communities and echoed in the New Testament, expands on this tension by introducing a group known as the Watchers. These beings were not created as rebels or adversaries, but were originally sent by God to observe, guard, and oversee the earth as entrusted stewards. They were not demons, nor were they fallen at the beginning, but appointed sentinels positioned within creation itself. And then, something shifted. Enoch does not speak vaguely about their failure, but names them and records their rebellion, describing how 200 watchers, led by a figure named Samjaza, descended upon Mount Hermon and crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. They looked upon the daughters of men, took them as wives, and began to impart forbidden knowledge, secrets never intended for human possession, and power never meant to rest in mortal hands. What emerged from this union was something entirely unnatural. Neither angel nor human, but a hybrid race known as the Nephilim. And their existence marked the moment betrayal became manifest. These were not legends shaped by imagination, but rebels carrying the imprint of heaven within corrupted flesh. The Watchers were not monsters in their origin, because they were holy, ordained, and trusted. Yet they abandoned their assigned posts, allowing guardianship to erode into obsession and loyalty to decay into lust. And here lies the unsettling irony. The very title Watcher implies vigilance, protection, and judgment, revealing that they were never intended to be passive observers at all, but active participants whose failure would leave an imprint on the world that followed. They were not without authority, and they were not without assignment, which means the world before Adam was never empty or unmanaged, but operating under oversight long before mankind drew breath. Beings walked the earth before humanity existed, intelligent and powerful, entrusted with responsibility, and some of them fell. And according to several scholars, the rebellion of these Watchers may be directly connected to the chaos described in Genesis 1:2. suggesting that their defiance helped trigger the devastation that plunged the earth into darkness and void. Their fall was not minor or symbolic, because Scripture later reveals that God imprisoned them in the abyss, bound in chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day. Jude 1:6. A response reserved only for a rebellion of catastrophic scale. Yet the question remains whether their influence truly vanished, or whether traces of it still linger in the world today, hidden in ancient structures, forbidden technologies, and relics that do not align with any known timeline. They walked the earth before us, and some believe the echoes of their presence are not entirely gone. So before assuming that Adam stood alone at the dawn of history, it is worth asking whether he was placed into a world already scarred, already altered, and already haunted by what came before. Because what follows in Scripture escalates quickly, introducing beings so dangerous that God chose to flood the earth itself to contain them. Genesis 6:4 states that, "There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward," identifying them as the Nephilim. This term is not poetic exaggeration, but derives from the Hebrew root nephal, meaning to fall, describing beings who were neither fallen angels nor fallen men, but fallen hybrids, born from rebellion itself. They were shaped by violation, created through an act that was never meant to occur, carrying heavenly DNA within earthly wombs, and possessing power that did not belong in creation. The Nephilim were the direct offspring of the Watchers, the rogue sons of God who crossed the boundary between the divine and the human, and their existence was not accidental, but the result of intentional corruption. While they were physically imposing giants, their true threat lay beyond size, because they were violent, predatory, and corrosive to everything around them, becoming pollution in flesh rather than mere tyrants. Genesis 6:11 records that the earth was filled with violence, using the Hebrew word chamas, which conveys lawlessness, chaos, and brutality woven into the fabric of society. These beings did not merely threaten human civilization, they threatened the divine plan itself. Because from the beginning, God declared, "Let us make man in our image," and the Nephilim represented a direct hijacking of that image. They were not simply giants roaming the land, but an assault on the purity of humanity, defiling bloodlines, erasing boundaries, and infecting creation with something that could not be redeemed. Noah, therefore, is described not only as righteous, but as perfect in his generations, Genesis 6:9, using the Hebrew word tamim, the same term applied to a spotless sacrificial lamb. This was not merely moral integrity, but genetic purity, as Noah's lineage had remained untouched by Nephilim corruption. He stood as the last uncorrupted vessel through whom God could preserve his covenant, which led to a decision of terrifying scale. "I will wipe mankind from the face of the earth," Genesis 6:7. A declaration that reveals the flood was not solely about sin or punishment, but about resetting the human genome itself. The world had become unrecognizable, transformed into a hybrid landscape ruled by abominations. The ark was not simply a boat built for survival, but a genetic safeguard, a womb carried upon the waters of divine judgment, preserving only what could be restored. Every creature taken aboard was chosen with purpose, every pair untainted, every breath guarded for renewal. The Nephilim were wiped away, or so it seemed, because Genesis 6:4 leaves behind a chilling whisper, "and also afterward," implying their return and opening a mystery darker than it first appears. That mystery leads directly into the next phase of human history, where giants appear among kings and empires fall beneath their shadow. But before that story unfolds, the flood must be understood not as an ending, but as the beginning of something far more deliberate, raising the question of whether it was punishment alone or a calculated divine reset to preserve what remained human. And in the next chapter, that door opens wider than ever before. Genesis records that God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Genesis 6:5. A statement that goes far beyond ordinary sin and hints at a condition that had become irreversible. The earth was not merely corrupt in behavior, but fundamentally altered in nature, transformed into something it was never meant to be. A dark convergence had taken place, where spiritual rebellion collided with genetic corruption, producing a hybrid reality that shattered the boundary between heaven and earth. In response, God did not act with limited judgment, but with decisive finality, declaring, "I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land." Genesis 6:7. These words are not spoken in rage, but in grief, revealing the sorrow of a creator witnessing his own masterpiece mutate beyond recognition. This was not punishment alone, but intervention. Not destruction for its own sake, but surgical mercy. The flood was a global reset, a divine purge that buried not only wickedness, but an entire civilization whose corruption had spread beyond repair. God did not simply flood sin, He erased a world. We often imagine the flood as a wooden vessel drifting upon gentle rain. Yet Scripture describes something far more violent and overwhelming. All the fountains of the great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heavens were opened. Genesis 7:11. Unleashing destruction from both below and above. This was not a quiet cleansing, but a collision of divine judgment and tectonic upheaval. As mountains vanished, cities were consumed, names were erased, and entire histories disappeared beneath the waters. Imagine their towers, their technologies, their languages, all swallowed within weeks and seemingly erased from memory. And yet, if the Nephilim had embedded themselves into the very structure of civilization, then the flood was more than a reset of humanity. It was a containment strategy designed to quarantine what had gone wrong. Noah, his wife, his sons, and their wives, 8 souls in total, were not spared by chance, but deliberately preserved. God was not rescuing humanity at random, but safeguarding a bloodline, protecting the DNA and the seed through which the Messiah would one day come. Beneath the devastation, an unbreakable covenant remained intact. Even in the chaos, there was design. The ark was not merely a rescue vessel, but a mobile sanctuary, a floating garden carried across the waters of judgment, preserving not only life, but memory, language, and destiny. Let this settle deeply. Everything that existed before the flood, every monument, every voice, every king, every name, was buried, not just in sediment, but in silence. Yet Scripture leaves behind an unsettling twist. Genesis 6:4 quietly states, "and also afterward," suggesting that the Nephilim returned, that corruption survived, and that the war was far from over. This raises a haunting question. If the flood erased a civilization, what else may have survived, hidden, waiting, and poised to return? Ecclesiastes declares, "What has been will be again. What has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun." Ecclesiastes 1:9. A warning that history does not move in straight lines, but in echoes. We often assume modern civilization represents the pinnacle of human achievement. Yet what if we are not the first to reach such heights, but merely the rebuild erected upon ancient ruins? Across the world, stories rise from the dust of forgotten ages. Ancient Egyptian records speak of a golden age ruled by gods long before the pharaohs. Sumerian texts describe kings who reigned for thousands of years before a great flood. Mayan glyphs tell of civilizations destroyed by divine fire and water. And then there is Atlantis, described by Plato as a technologically advanced empire filled with knowledge, power, and pride, until it vanished beneath the sea in a single day and night. These accounts may not be myths at all, but fractured memories of a world that did not simply fall, but was buried, leaving behind echoes that still reverberate through our own fantasy, or fragments of a collective memory that refuses to die. Every myth begins somewhere, and more often than not, it begins with memory distorted by time rather than imagination. The question is not whether these stories are fictional, but what they are remembering. And nowhere does that question press harder than when we examine ancient architecture. How do structures exist that defy both time and logic? The Great Pyramid of Giza, aligned with celestial precision and built with mathematical accuracy that still challenges modern engineers, stands as a monument not only of stone, but of knowledge far ahead of its supposed age. In Baalbek, Lebanon, stones weighing over 1,000 tons were moved without machinery capable of lifting them today. Göbekli Tepe, older than any known civilization, displays carvings no hunter-gatherer society should have been able to produce. These are not isolated anomalies. They are fragments of a pattern, the exposed bones of something older and more advanced than conventional timelines allow. The Bible does not catalog these civilizations, but it whispers their traces. Genesis 6:4 states that the Nephilim were in the earth in those days, and also afterward. Those final words matter. And also afterward suggests survival, persistence, and memory carried beyond the flood. What we now call mythology may be the traumatized recollections of survivors, reshaped over centuries into stories of gods, titans, and monsters. But what if they were never gods at all? What if they were Nephilim, enthroned, armored, and worshipped by humanity too fearful to resist? What if what we call magic was simply forbidden knowledge passed down from the Watchers? The Book of Enoch records that they taught metallurgy, weaponry, enchantments, and astronomy, knowledge wildly out of place in a primitive age. And then there is Eden. If these ruins echo pre-flood brilliance, where does Eden belong? Could it have been the center of that first world, the original intersection between the divine and the human? Could humanity's universal longing for a lost paradise be a fractured memory of the garden we were expelled from? And if so, was Eden buried or protected? Hidden from history or hidden from the unholy? To answer that, Scripture pulls us deeper, beyond Adam, beyond Eden, to another fall that sent shockwaves through creation itself. Before Adam ever breathed, before Eden bloomed, another being had already fallen from heaven, and the consequences of that rebellion never stopped echoing. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High, was not the language of service, but of seizure, revealing a will no longer content to worship, but determined to rule. And with that declaration, heaven itself fractured, as war broke out beyond human sight. There was war in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon, making it clear that the serpent did not slip quietly into Eden, because he had already fallen long before he ever spoke to man. He was not an invader in the garden, but an exile cast down to the earth in fury, dragging with him a third of the stars, a third of the angelic host. Woe to the earth and the sea, Scripture warns, for the devil has come down to you. Revelation 12:12. Not because earth was his prize, but because earth had become his prison. And here the story turns darker still, because some scholars and ancient commentators suggest that Lucifer once ruled a dominion before Adam, a pre-Adamic world placed under his authority until rebellion corrupted it and judgment followed. This interpretation aligns with the unsettling chaos of Genesis 1:2, where the earth is described as becoming formless and void, raising the question of what Lucifer fell into when he was cast down. Some propose that the wasteland described there is the shattered remains of his failed kingdom, a dominion reduced to rubble, its throne buried beneath darkness. This would explain the serpent's confidence in Eden, his cunning, and his ancient knowledge, because he was not guessing at the stakes. He had once stood near God's throne, and now he moved among creatures made in the image of the one who cast him down. Lucifer's objective was never merely to deceive Adam and Eve, but to reclaim access to what he had lost, using humanity as the means of retaliation. Every temptation in Eden carried the weight of centuries, every whisper laced with bitterness born of exile. Yet a question remains. Why was he allowed to remain on the earth at all? And why was he not destroyed immediately? Because the war was not finished, only transferred, shifting its battlefield from heaven to humanity. And this reframes the purpose of Adam entirely, forcing us to ask whether he was placed in Eden simply to rule the earth, or to finish a war Lucifer had begun. Adam was not spoken into existence the way the rest of creation was. He was formed, shaped, handled. God stooped to the dust and worked it with intention, then breathed life directly into him, signaling that Adam was not simply another creature, but a deliberate response to something that had already gone wrong. He was not placed into an untouched world, but into a restored zone carved out of chaos, a space ordered again after judgment. Eden was not merely a paradise for enjoyment. It was a boundary, a controlled intersection between heaven's authority and a world that still carried echoes of collapse. Adam's assignment was therefore more than tending plants and naming animals. It included guarding, standing watch, and maintaining order where disorder had once ruled. Dominion was given to Adam not as a gift of comfort, but as a mandate to reclaim lost authority. Something had been forfeited before him, and Adam was positioned to occupy what had been vacated. His rule was meant to be restorative, not exploitative, a visible declaration that God's image would once again govern the earth. Yet Adam's failure did not occur in isolation. His disobedience echoed an earlier rebellion, repeating a pattern of choosing autonomy over trust and self-rule over submission. Still, Adam was never the final answer. From the beginning, he functioned as a template. Scripture itself frames him this way, as Romans presents Adam as a type, a shadow pointing forward to someone greater. This means the redemption plan was not improvised after Adam fell. It was already in motion when he was formed, anticipating failure and preparing fulfillment. Jesus is not called the second Adam, but the last Adam, because he did not come to repeat a failed pattern, but to bring it to an end. Where Adam opened the wound, Christ closed it. Where Adam surrendered authority, Christ reclaimed it, not only restoring what was lost in Eden, but redeeming what creation itself had forfeited long before Eden ever bloomed. His victory was not symbolic, philosophical, or confined to theology. It was cosmic. The cross did not merely forgive sin, it reversed exile. Authority was restored, not as an abstract promise deferred to the future, but as a present reality anchored in sacrifice. Forgiveness was never the destination. It was the doorway. Restoration was always the goal. Creation itself still groans under the weight of that unfinished unveiling, waiting for what Christ has already secured to be fully revealed. The earth remembers fracture. The heavens remember rebellion. And humanity stands in the tension between victory accomplished and victory enforced. This is why believers are not positioned as observers of history, but as participants within it. The war did not end at the cross. It changed phase. What was decided there is now carried forward through obedience, faith, and allegiance. Victory was won decisively, but it is lived out daily. Every act of faith, every refusal to bow to what Christ has already defeated, becomes enforcement of a kingdom that has already been established. This is why the conflict still matters, and why knowledge alone is not enough. Understanding the story does not leave you neutral. It places responsibility on the listener. Revelation demands response. The question is no longer what existed before Adam, or what fell before Eden, but what you will do with the truth now that the pattern has been revealed. Because you are not standing outside this narrative, looking back at ancient history. You are standing inside it. The same war that began before man now presses into your choices, your allegiance, and your faith. And the same victory secured by Christ now calls for alignment, not curiosity. If this message challenged you, take a moment to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the